In the remote mountains of Montana, ecological rangers discovered Jasper, a young bobcat kitten, dying after falling from a cliff and suffering serious injuries. Clinging to life by a thread, he was rushed to a wildlife veterinarian who had dedicated her life to saving the wild. What began as a routine wildlife rescue would evolve into something no veterinary textbook could explain. As this vet fought to save the injured little bobcat, a bond was forged in those critical moments. Then something extraordinary began to happen. A connection so intense that the wild kitten started refusing care from anyone else but her. His fierce will to survive became inseparable from her presence. Who was this vet? And how would she prepare a wild animal for a world it could no longer survive in because its heart now belonged to her? Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning mist clung to the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains like a ghost reluctant to leave. Ranger Tom Mitchell had been hiking these trails for 23 years. But the sound that stopped him in his tracks that September morning was unlike anything he'd heard before. A desperate, keening cry that seemed to come from the very rocks themselves. Following the sound down a treacherous slope, Tom's weathered hands gripped the rough granite as he descended. There, wedged between two boulders at the base of a 30-foot cliff, was a sight that made his heart sink. A bobcat kitten, no more than 8 weeks old, lay twisted at an unnatural angle, his spotted fur matted with blood and dirt. "Easy there, little guy," Tom whispered, pulling out his radio with one hand while keeping his eyes on the injured animal. The kitten's amber eyes, glazed with pain and fear, tracked his every movement. When Tom reached out slowly, the kitten tried to hiss but only managed a weak mewl that broke the ranger's heart. Dr. Margaret Maggie Walsh was just finishing her morning rounds at the Montana Wildlife Rehabilitation Center when the call came in. At 52, she'd dedicated the last 25 years of her life to saving injured wildlife. But emergency calls still made her pulse quicken. "Bobcat kitten, severe trauma from a fall," her assistant Jake reported as they prepared the emergency intake room. "Rangers estimate he's been there at least 12 hours, maybe more." Maggie's mind was already running through protocols as she scrubbed in. Spinal injuries in young animals were particularly devastating. Their developing bodies couldn't compensate the way adults could. But she'd learned long ago not to give up before she'd even begun. When Tom arrived with the kitten wrapped in his jacket, Maggie's first assessment wasn't promising. The little bobcat, she'd already started thinking of him as Jasper after the reddish tinge to his coat, was barely conscious. His breathing was shallow and labored, and when she gently palpated his spine, he didn't even flinch at what should have been excruciating pain. "Get me a full panel, X-rays, blood work, everything," she ordered, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she started an IV line. The kitten's veins were so small she had to use a catheter designed for newborn humans. "And call Dr. Peterson from neurology. We're going to need all hands on deck for this one." The next hours blurred together in a symphony of medical intervention. X-rays revealed what Maggie had feared: a compression fracture of the L3 vertebra with significant swelling around the spinal cord. Blood work showed severe dehydration and the beginning stages of organ failure from starvation. The kitten had likely fallen days ago and had been slowly dying alone in the mountains. His mother must have abandoned him after the fall, Jake observed quietly as they worked to stabilize Jasper's vitals. It was nature's harsh arithmetic. An injured kitten was a liability that could endanger the whole family. But as Maggie looked down at the small form on her examination table, something in those amber eyes spoke of a fierce will to survive. Even through the haze of pain medication, Jasper was watching her, his gaze following her movements with an intensity that belied his critical condition. "Not on my watch," she murmured, adjusting his IV drip. "You're not giving up, and neither am I." The first night was touch and go. Maggie refused to leave Jasper's side, catching catnaps in a chair pulled up beside his incubator. Every time his breathing hitched or his heart rate dropped, she was there, adjusting medications, whispering encouragement, her hand gently stroking the soft fur between his ears. It was during one of these vigils that the first miracle happened. As dawn light crept through the windows, Jasper's eyes fluttered open and focused on Maggie's face. Slowly, painfully, he lifted one small paw and placed it against the incubator wall, right where her hand rested on the other side. "That's my brave boy," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "That's my fighter." Over the following days, a routine emerged that would define both their lives. Mornings began with careful neurological assessments, checking reflexes, testing sensation, looking for any signs of improvement. The spinal inflammation was severe, and Maggie had to walk a tightrope between pain management and maintaining enough sensation for healing. Physical therapy started on day 3. Though therapy was perhaps too grand a word for the gentle manipulation of Jasper's hind legs. He couldn't move them himself yet, but Maggie spent hours carefully flexing and extending each joint, massaging the muscles to prevent atrophy. It was during these sessions that something extraordinary began to happen. Jasper, who remained wary and defensive with other staff members, would completely relax in Maggie's hands. His breathing would slow, and sometimes he'd even purr, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed too big for his small body. "He's imprinted on you," Dr. Peterson observed during one of his consultations. "It's unusual, but not unheard of in cases of severe trauma. You're his safety anchor." The truth of this became apparent whenever Maggie tried to leave Jasper's care to other staff members. The normally quiet kitten would cry incessantly, refusing food and medication until she returned. His vital signs would spike with stress, undoing hours of careful progress. "Looks like you've got yourself a shadow," Jake joked, but there was concern in his eyes. Wildlife rehabilitation was about preparing animals to return to the wild, not creating dependencies. By the second week, Jasper had graduated from critical care to the recovery ward, but his attachment to Maggie had only grown stronger. He'd learned the sound of her footsteps and would call out before she even reached his enclosure. When she entered, he'd drag himself toward her despite the obvious pain it caused, not settling until she picked him up and cradled him against her chest. The breakthrough came on day 18. Maggie was performing Jasper's morning therapy when she felt it, a tiny push back against her hand as she flexed his right hind leg. "Did you just—" She repeated the movement, holding her breath. There it was again. Weak, but unmistakable. Jasper was fighting to move his leg himself. "Jake!" she called, her voice cracking with emotion. "Jake, come see this." From that moment, Jasper's recovery accelerated beyond their most optimistic projections. Within days, he was pulling himself forward with his front legs, while his hind legs made increasingly coordinated attempts to follow. Maggie modified his physical therapy to encourage these movements, creating an obstacle course of soft pillows and rolled towels for him to navigate. But it was the emotional healing that proved most remarkable. Jasper had developed a ritual that melted hearts throughout the facility. Every morning, when Maggie arrived for his care, he would perform what the staff dubbed his greeting dance, a series of chirps and purrs accompanied by enthusiastic headbutts against her hands. Only after this ritual would he submit to his medical checks and therapy. The bond between them became something of a legend at the center. Veteran staff members who'd worked with countless wild animals had never seen anything quite like it. Jasper wasn't just tolerating human contact for survival. He was actively seeking it, but only from Maggie. "It's like he's decided you're his mother," Dr. Peterson mused during a team meeting 6 weeks into Jasper's recovery. The question is, what do we do about it? It was a question that kept Maggie awake at night. Jasper was healing remarkably well. Follow-up MRIs showed the spinal fracture knitting together better than expected, and the nerve damage, while still present, was no longer progressing. Physically, he was becoming more Bobcat-like every day, playing with toys, practicing his pouncing, even attempting the characteristic Bobcat yowl. But behaviorally, he was far from wild. His early separation from his mother meant he'd missed crucial weeks of learning hunting techniques and survival skills. His imprinting on Maggie had created a deep trust of humans that would be dangerous in the wild. And most concerningly, he showed no fear response to human presence. A death sentence for a wild predator. The day Jasper first jumped successfully, a full 2 feet from one platform to another, should have been a moment of pure celebration. And it was, with the entire staff gathering to watch and cheer. But as Maggie watched him land gracefully and immediately run to her for praise and comfort, she felt a bittersweet pang. "He can't go back, can he?" Jake asked quietly, voicing what they all knew. Maggie shook her head, gathering Jasper into her arms where he promptly began his rumbling purr. He's too humanized. Releasing him would be signing his death warrant." The decision to transition Jasper to permanent sanctuary status wasn't made lightly. The center typically focused on rehabilitation and release, taking in permanent residents only in the most exceptional circumstances. But Jasper's case was textbook exceptional. As his strength returned, a new challenge emerged. Jasper's attachment to Maggie, while touching, was becoming problematic for his long-term care. He would refuse to eat if she was gone for more than a day, and his stress behaviors when she wasn't present were concerning the entire team. "We need to work on healthy separation," Dr. Peterson advised, "for both your sakes." Thus began a delicate process of gradually increasing Jasper's independence while maintaining the bond that had saved his life. Maggie started by having other caregivers present during their sessions, letting Jasper grow accustomed to their presence. Slowly, she would step back and let others take over portions of his care, always remaining in sight to provide reassurance. It was harder on Maggie than she'd expected. She'd maintained professional boundaries with hundreds of animals over her career, but something about Jasper had slipped past all her defenses. Maybe it was the way he'd fought so hard to survive, or how he'd trusted her completely when he had every reason to fear humans. Maybe it was simply that sometimes connections form that defy logical explanation. The construction of Jasper's permanent enclosure became a labor of love for the entire facility. Unlike the standard rehabilitation spaces, this one was designed for a lifetime of comfort and enrichment. It featured climbing structures that accommodated his slight residual weakness, hidden passages for exploration, and a special veterinary access area where Maggie could conduct his ongoing care with minimal stress. "It's perfect," Maggie breathed when she saw the finished space. "He's going to love it." The move to his new home was scheduled for day 92 of his recovery, a symbolic milestone that marked his transition from patient to permanent resident. The entire staff gathered to witness it, many wiping away tears as they watched the little Bobcat who'd arrived more dead than alive now prowl confidently into his new domain. But the most moving moment came when Jasper, after thoroughly investigating every corner of his new space, returned to where Maggie stood at the viewing window. He placed his paws against the glass and gave his characteristic chirp, the same sound he'd made every morning for weeks. "I'm not going anywhere, buddy," Maggie promised, her hand pressed against the glass meeting his paws. "This is just the beginning of our story." The months that followed brought new challenges and rewards. Jasper adapted to his sanctuary life with remarkable resilience, developing routines and preferences that delighted his caregivers. He became somewhat of an ambassador for the facility, his story inspiring donations and support that helped other injured wildlife. But the special bond with Maggie remained at the heart of his life. She restructured her schedule to ensure she could spend time with him daily, their morning sessions evolving from medical necessity to mutual enrichment. She taught him games that challenged his recovering body and sharp mind. He taught her that the connection between human and wild animal could transcend the expected boundaries while still respecting the essential wildness of his nature. Other staff members gradually earned Jasper's trust, though none ever achieved the complete acceptance he showed with Maggie. He would play with Jake, tolerate examination from Dr. Peterson, and even perform for tour groups from a safe distance. But when he was hurt, scared, or simply needed comfort, it was always Maggie he sought. "You know," Jake observed one evening as they watched Jasper demonstrate his fully recovered jumping abilities, "I used to think the goal was always to return them to the wild. But sometimes, I wonder if animals like Jasper aren't meant to teach us something else." Maggie nodded, watching as Jasper executed a perfect Bobcat twist in midair before landing gracefully on his platform. Maybe it's about finding the wild within ourselves, the part that recognizes connection beyond species, beyond logic. As if in agreement, Jasper bounded over to the viewing window and performed his greeting dance, even though Maggie had been there all day. She laughed, the sound mixing with his chirps and purrs in a harmony that spoke of healing, hope, and the unbreakable bonds that sometimes form when we least expect them. The sun was setting over the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere in those peaks, wild bobcats hunted and roamed free. And here, in this carefully crafted sanctuary, one special bobcat had found a different kind of freedom. The freedom to be exactly who he was, loved and protected, wild and tame, independent, yet never alone. Maggie placed her hand against the glass one more time before heading home, and Jasper pressed his paw against it in their nightly farewell ritual. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new growth, new moments of connection. But for now, in this perfect moment, a woman and a bobcat shared a love that asked for nothing but presence, offering everything in return. "Sleep tight, my brave boy," Maggie whispered. "See you in the morning." And Jasper, safe in his sanctuary, surrounded by enrichment and care, settled into his favorite sleeping spot, the one closest to where Maggie would appear when dawn broke over the mountains once again. In the end, perhaps that's what all healing comes down to. Not just the mending of bones and tissue, but the courage to trust, to connect, and to find safety in unexpected places. Jasper had refused to leave the vet who saved him not out of dependence, but out of a recognition that some bonds, once formed, become part of who we are. And in the Montana Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, under the watchful eyes of dedicated caregivers and one very special veterinarian, a bobcat named Jasper lived proof that love knows no boundaries. Not species, not circumstance, not even the divide between wild and tame. He was and would always be exactly where he belonged.